Hello, everyone. My name is Quinn Giordano, and this is my independent study on LGBTQ history in the United States. Now, before I really get into this, I just want to give a brief disclaimer that this is in no way the entire history of the LGBTQ community in the US. That would be very difficult to do. This is just some key parts of history and leading figures in the community. And now I'm going to start. So I start off with the two-spirit identity, which is someone who identifies as having both masculine and feminine spirits. And it is seen as a gift in Native tradition, which is where the identity comes from. And it is not male or female, but they are able to see both the male and female perspective. Pictured to the right is Wiwa of the Zuni tribe in New Mexico, who is a two-spirit person. And this whole idea of being two-spirit is really grounded in the Native view of sexuality and gender. In Native tradition, sexuality and gender is seen as much more of a circle than a line, as pictured on the bottom. And someone can land anywhere along the circle or spectrum, and it can actually change over time, and they can even land outside of the circle. And the West is much more strict with the line. They have either male or female, or somewhere in between those two genders. And that can be really harmful to identity, as we have found, kind of analyzing it further. It can be really hard to express yourself within that boundary. And how the two-spirit identity really came to be is the basket and bow, which is tradition in Great Basin tribes. And it starts off with a child who is very young, and if a child chooses the basket, they would live with female roles in society, and if a child chooses the bow, they would live with male roles in society. And a child choosing an item other than what is set for their birth sex, being male or female, that identifies them as two-spirit. So, for example, if I were a very young child and I, identifying as male and being born as male, chose the basket, I would live with female roles in society and then be considered two-spirit. And branching a little off from the two-spirit identity, but still in the LGBTQ community and indigenous community, there is the first gay indigenous American liberation organization, the Gay American Indians, which was formed in 1975 as a place to discuss intersectionality of identities. And intersectionality is kind of a key word when discussing any queer issues or any marginalized people issues, basically. And is when one identity intersects with another. In this example, it is the identity of being indigenous intersecting with being gay or part of the LGBTQ community. And this organization was founded as a social alternative to the discrimination faced in the Castro district of San Francisco, which you will see come up a little bit later in the presentation. And the Castro district is historically a gay community, but it's also historically exclusionary as a white gay male community. And it has not branched much out of that, which has been very harmful to many other identities. And next, chronologically, is drag. And drag is the performance of masculinity, femininity, or other forms of gender expression. And pictured here is a drag queen, which is someone, often male, who performs femininity. And there can also be drag kings, someone often male who performs masculinity. And I'm just going to give you guys a full view of this image because it is a truly iconic image of drag in the late 80s when it really started to take off in pop culture. But the origins of drag actually date back to 1870, and it's in reference to when male actors dressed in women's clothing. William Dorsey Swann, who was born enslaved in Hancock, Maryland, started drag balls in the 1880s in Washington, D.C., and they were attended by other formerly enslaved men. And male performers wore petticoats in female roles, since women were not allowed to have a role in any show or performance. So the men would dress up as women in petticoats, and those petticoats would drag on the floor, and so they referred to dressing up as women as putting on their drag, hence the term drag, someone who identifies usually as male dressing up in a female role. And we jump forward to the 1930s in the pansy craze, and it was most prominent in 1930 to 33. And drag queens, which were then known as pansy performers, really experienced a surge in underground popularity due to prohibition, which gave spaces for drag to really thrive in that underground or elusive environment. And this actually dates back to Harlem's 1869 masquerade balls in New York, where it really took off. And Malene, pictured here, is one of the most prominent performers of the pansy craze. And currently in drag, RuPaul's Drag Race has given drag lots of recognition that it truly deserves in pop culture. And there has now been common terms that are derived from drag culture, such as throwing shade, realness, yas, and other iterations such as yas queen. And it really gave queer people of color a national stage and represented queer people in a realistic and unaltered way. Quoting RuPaul here, "You're not getting some rehearsed version of the gay experience. You're getting it straight up, raw, and unfiltered in reality TV, as opposed to some scripted show with one gay side character." And next we jump to the 1940s or 60s. You'll see I'm making these big jumps because there are a lot of gaps in LGBTQ history, and I'm just kind of taking what I found and what I could get from searching online for half a year. And from 1940 to 1960, thousands of gay employees were fired from the federal workforce. And this is due to being considered both mentally ill and associated with communism. And the Lavender Scare does coincide with the Red Scare, which was the big fear of communism in the United States at the time. And it was not really called the Lavender Scare until after it happened. It went into the official title of the Sex Perversion Elimination Program, which targeted gay men for arrest in any government position. And at the same time, gay was classified as a mental illness, and it was considered a sociopathic personality disturbance by the APA up until 1973. And anti-sodomy laws in the US also made being gay illegal, which made getting any sort of job or employment very difficult with this illegal and mentally ill status. And at the same time, it was kind of a compound issue of McCarthy fearing that LGBTQ people had infiltrated the government, and he heavily promoted this idea to the American public, which in turn caused LGBTQ people to be seen as security risks and overall just disloyal. And this government action of getting or purging gay employees and getting rid of them emboldened local police forces to make more arrests around the country in any community on homosexual activity, which was whatever they deemed as homosexual activity. And government discrimination based on sexuality actually continued until Clinton signed 2 executive orders banning such discrimination in the 90s. So this legacy lasted much longer than just the time period given for the Lavender Scare. And this not only just had big issues, but also personal issues. Warning, there's a discussion of suicide on this slide. If you are not comfortable with that, I urge you to either skip this part of the video, or if this is being shown in the class, you may leave the room. And Andrew Ferencz is a man who committed suicide at the age of 34, 2 days after investigation into his sexuality by the State Department. He was administrative assistant at the U.S. Embassy in Paris, and that is where he died. The State Department covered up the cause of his death and lied to his family about his identity, further lessening who he was as a gay man and as his position, and really making sure that nobody knew that he was gay. And he was so ashamed of actually coming home and admitting that he was gay and who he was to his family that he deemed suicide a better option, and it never is. Up next is the Madison Society, and it was the first sustained gay rights group in the United States, and it was very prominent during the homophile movement, which was a term that was used before the word homosexual really gained popularity. As you can see on the door over here, the East Coast Homophile Organization. This is in New York. Even though the Madison Society did originate in Los Angeles in 1950, branches expanded to every major city across the country, hence why this photo is in New York, on the other side of the nation. And the group was founded by communist Harry Hay and other leftist organizers, which might not have helped the communist speculations of the gay community, but again, you kind of get what you can. And the Madison Society is really infamous for their sit-ins, which was a nod to the civil rights era sit-ins. And this also occurred mainly in New York because New York State Liquor Authority prevented serving gay customers, stating that being gay was in itself a disorderly conduct. And gay bars actually formed in part due to this discrimination because gay people really decided that if they're not going to be served in straight bars or I guess treated with any sort of decency and seen as human, they were going to form their own safe space and have their own community area. And these bars were frequently raided, but that did give publicity to these movements, and it really spread the movement from these moments of seeing bars getting raided, but it just got the word out that gay people exist and they are here in the 1950s. But one of the downfalls of the Madison Society was that it was very exclusive, and it really discouraged deviant expressions, what they said was deviant expressions of gender identity through clothing, and encouraged blending in with the rest of society. A crucial message of the society being, we look like anybody else, so we should be treated like anybody else. Encouraged to dress in more formal attire and really blend in with either male or female roles at the time while being gay. But that Madison Society really excluded transgender people due to these roles, or any gender non-conforming people were really excluded due to these roles of dress your gender, and that led to the society's downfall. But soon after the society, the Stonewall movement and Stonewall, what some people call riots, occurred. And when many people think of Stonewall, they think of the actual event, which is quoted here on just a little Google blurb as a spontaneous riot against police. But people who really see this just as one moment and one riot don't know the full meaning of Stonewall to the LGBTQ community. Stonewall represents the true beginning of the gay liberation movement gaining traction and momentum in popular media. This is the first time LGBTQ peoples were really publicized and the world paid attention. And yes, Stonewall was a physical event, it was a physical riot, but it represents the beginning of a movement and of liberation and finally freedom. One of the key leaders in the Stonewall movement is Marsha P. Johnson, and she is one of the most famous people in the LGBTQ community historically. She was a Black transgender woman at the lead of the Stonewall movement. And in her name, the P was not actually a middle name, it just stood for Pay It No Mind, in reference to questions to her gender. And she also previously went by Black Marsha, all caps, with emphasis on her race, really once again bringing that intersectionality of being Black and transgender, both, not one or the other. And she was the co-founder of the STAR program, which provided food and shelter to LGBTQ plus youth. And unfortunately, soon after she did all this activism, she was found dead in the Hudson River after a pride parade, one of the first pride parades. And it was ruled a suicide by police, though injuries were found on her head and anti-gay hate crimes were at an all-time high. There's been a lot of speculation that this was a murder and that this was not in fact a suicide, but police did not look into it, so we never have found it. Another leader of the Stonewall movement was Sylvia Rivera, who fought against exclusion of trans women of color in LGBTQ movements. And she was another Stonewall protest frontline activist with Marsha and the co-founder of the STAR program, which provided food and shelter to LGBTQ plus youth. And Sylvia continued her activism until her death from cancer in 2002. So, then we have this quick video of the Stonewall riots here by the History Channel. It's a really good summary of what it meant after these ads.
Sitka gear has by far. In the early morning hours of June 28, 1969, a riot broke out in front of the Stonewall Inn in New York City. The violent protest became known as the Stonewall Riots. The Stonewall Riots were a watershed moment in the gay rights movement, sparking activism and awareness across the United States. We'll look at the roots of the riots, the events, and their lasting impact. In the 1950s and 60s, homosexuality was still considered sodomy and illegal in 49 states. The punishments varied greatly by state, ranging from heavy fines to imprisonment. In society, members of the gay community were often subject to violence, harassment, and discrimination. In New York City, gay bars were havens for people with diverse sexual orientations and gender identities, places where they could avoid harassment and violence. The Stonewall Inn served as a popular refuge. The Stonewall Inn was owned by the Mafia. The Mafia bribed the police to look the other way. In turn, the Mafia made money overcharging patrons for drinks. Even so, the patrons were not fully safe from homophobia and discrimination. The Mafia would extort wealthy patrons, threatening to out them to their employers and families. Despite the Mafia's bribes, the police still regularly raided the Stonewall Inn and other gay bars, charging them with solicitation of homosexual relations. Trans and other gender nonconforming people were also targeted, subjected to violence, and arrested if they weren't wearing what the police deemed gender-appropriate clothing. This oppression and mistreatment came to a head in the early morning hours of June 28, 1969. 9 police officers entered the Stonewall Inn in a raid. The patrons were fed up. As the police roughly tried to arrest bartenders and customers, many resisted. Outside the bar, people in the hundreds began rioting. They threw bottles and pushed through the barricades. The police officers retreated from the crowd and locked themselves inside the Stonewall Inn. Rioters responded by setting the bar on fire. Police reinforcement arrived, and the original officers managed to get out of the burning bar. Meanwhile, the angry mob had grown into thousands. Eventually, the police were able to get the crowd to disperse, but it didn't last long. The riots continued until July 1st. While some criticized the violent and destructive riots, others pointed to the brutality and unjust treatment of the gay community. This large-scale defiance made a massive impact on society. The Stonewall riots were the beginning of the modern gay liberation movement, which also brought attention to others marginalized for their sexual or gender orientation. The riots sparked the formation of the Gay Liberation Front, the first group to publicly advocate for equal gay rights. On the one-year anniversary of the riots, they also organized the first Gay Pride Parade. Today, Pride events are still held on the anniversary of the Stonewall riots in cities around the country and even the world. In 2016, President Obama made the Stonewall Inn in the area outside where the riots broke out a national monument. This became the first national monument celebrating gay history. The Stonewall riots may have been violent, but they marked a pivotal moment in history. No longer would people quietly endure the stigma associated with their sexual and gender orientation. Through the Stonewall riots, the gay rights movement gained mainstream visibility and a momentum that continues to this day.
All right, I'm going to get us back to our presentation now. But that's just a really good overview of what Stonewall was and how it impacted the queer community moving forward in history. And it was really a spark for LGBTQ rights, as we just saw. And this movement, the Stonewall movement, really caused the LGBTQ population to gain more momentum, especially in the fight for legal protection, which is critical because, as you saw, there were many discriminatory practices in place at the time and far into the future after that movement that needed to be dealt with legally. And this also gave, again, more publicity for LGBTQ movements and dramatically kind of shaped how the public saw the LGBTQ community. And then Harvey Milk came along on the other side of the country in California. He was one of the first openly gay elected officials in the United States, and he was a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in 1978. He had, prior to this, experienced a forced discharge from the military due to his homosexuality, and he encouraged LGBTQ political participation, showing that gay and LGBTQ plus people can attain power in society and positions of power, be it in government or other organizations. Unfortunately, Harvey Milk was assassinated, and this is in part due to his organization of gay rights movements during a spike in hate. Hate crimes in the historically gay Castro district increased, and that led to Milk's assassination along with the San Francisco mayor by former city supervisor Dan White. And Milk actually did anticipate his assassination, and he left a lasting legacy through his will and many speeches. And he gave hope to people even after death. And just a slight warning, in this video there is discussion of suicide.
Somewhere in Des Moines or San Antonio, there's a young gay person who all of a sudden realizes that she or he is gay, knows that if the parents find out, they'll be tossed out of the house. The classmates would taunt the child, and the Anita Bryans and John Briggs are doing their bit on TV, and that child had several options. Staying in a closet, suicide, and then one day that child might open a paper and says homosexual elected in San Francisco, and there are two new options. The option is to go to California, stay in San Antonio and fight. 2 days after I was elected, I got a phone call, and the voice was quite young. It was from Altoona, Pennsylvania, and the person said, "Thanks. And you've got to elect gay people so that that young child and the thousands upon thousands like that child know that there's hope for a better world. There's hope for a better tomorrow. Without hope, not only gays, but those blacks, and the Asians, and the disabled, and the seniors, the S's. Without hope, the S's give up. I know that you cannot live on hope alone, but without it, life is not worth living. And you got to give them hope. Thank you very much.
So that is a really inspirational speech by Harvey Milk before his assassination, kind of showing how influential he was through his speaking to the gay community and LGBTQ community as a whole. And he was also very well known for wearing the pink triangle armband, as seen in the last image and here. and it was historically used as a marker in the Holocaust for gay men. As seen here, the pink triangle patch is overlaid with a golden triangle, creating a Star of David, indicating that this man was both gay and Jewish in Auschwitz. But this symbol, the pink triangle, was reclaimed as a symbol of pride and protest against homophobia really in the 1970s. And Harvey Milk often wore this symbol at protests or campaigning for his election, and it became a well-known symbol for LGBTQ activist groups in mainly Europe and North America, but eventually spreading globally. And soon after Harvey Milk, the AIDS crisis ensued. AIDS is a deadly STD that is transmitted through bodily fluids, and this crisis primarily affected gay men and people of color. The government refused to help or acknowledge the epidemic due to the affected demographic being gay men and people of color, and it became known as the Gay Plague due to how many gay men that it was killing. And pictured here is Ken Meeks, an AIDS patient in San Francisco in 1986. And the AIDS epidemic really started and severely worsened under the Reagan administration. And this is due to the extreme inaction to the epidemic that Reagan took. And it took Reagan 4 years to publicly say the word AIDS after it was first discovered in the US. 4 years. And Reagan's communications director, Pat Buchanan, repeatedly argued that AIDS is, quote, nature's revenge on gay men. And the whole crisis really was not taken as seriously as it should have been, and it became a joke in a sense.
Got our favorites. Chicken McNugget.
Let me guess, a Big Mac?
What's that?
Right after this.
That's a McNugget, Dad.
What McNugget?
I can literally see it.
Enjoy any two classics for $6, like a Big Mac or 10-piece chicken McNuggets for a limited time at McDonald's.
Alright, sorry for the slight technical difficulties, just really trying to get this video to work.
President have any reaction to the announcement from the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta that AIDS is now an epidemic, over 600 cases, and that over a third of them are not. It's known as gay plague. No, it is. I mean, it's a pretty serious thing. That one in every 3 people that get this have died, and I wondered if the president is aware of it. I don't have it. Do you? You don't have it. Well, I'm relieved to hear that. Do you? You didn't answer my question. How do you know? The president, in other words, the White House looked on this as a great job. No, I don't know anything about it, Lance. Was the president, does anyone in the White House know about this epidemic? I don't think so. I don't think nobody knows. There's been no personal experience here, Lester. Okay. Doctor, I checked thoroughly with Dr. Rugen this morning, and he said no.
So, as you can see, the Reagan administration did not take this epidemic very seriously and really viewed it as a joke that would not affect them or spiral out of control as it did. And this inaction did lead to lesbians helping the gay community in a way that was extremely nice of them, considering the discrimination that they had faced from within their own community and gay men within the community. And lesbians treated patients with HIV/AIDS when no one else would. Lesbians in healthcare would go into their rooms and help them. Lesbian groups like the Blood Sisters formed to donate blood to AIDS patients who were in desperate need of a transfusion. And due to this help, the acronym actually shifted from GLBT to LGBT. And that is deliberate, and it was to honor the lesbian AIDS caretakers. And they were so necessary because at the time there was a lot of misinformation about how AIDS spread, and many healthcare workers did not want to be in the same room as AIDS patients, which often led to a lack of necessary care, like food being delivered to inside of the room instead of being just left at the doorstep, or help to the bathroom instead of leaving them in their own beds. And it was basically lesbians becoming gay men's and other AIDS patients' caretakers during this immense time of difficulty. And this inaction from the Reagan administration in basically every place of power led to a protest group called ACT UP, which is an acronym that stands for the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. And they were upset at the lack of government action or any scientific research into AIDS, and their motto was actually United in Anger. They are notorious for their die-ins, which are pictured here, where they would basically all get in a big group and collapse or die on the floor. And they were also known for their kiss-ins, which is when any gay couple would kiss in a public area, and that would really cause, at that time, public outcry or outrage in whatever community they were in. And the ACT UP protest group often held public and disruptive protests, such as halting traffic, invading conferences, and overthrowing banquets. And these methods of protests influenced greatly how protests happen today, and they also gave publicity to the movement. They got people to pay attention and to actually listen. And though ACT UP was small in numbers, they had large media coverage due to the method, style, and type of protest that they were using. And Keith Haring is an infamous gay pop artist known for bright figures and political street art. And he is also a notable AIDS activist, as he sent messages through his art and used his art as a means of resistance, working with ACT UP, as you can see in the image on the right. Ignorance equals fear, silence equals death, the pink triangle, and Fight AIDS, ACT UP. And he created public art in the streets of New York City, allowing everyone to see it. It was not really tucked away in a museum or somewhere you had to pay to get into or make it through the doors. It was just in the street where everyone could see it and everyone could get the message. And unfortunately, Keith Haring died on February 16th, 1990, of AIDS-related complications. Here are a few of his works that really focused on the AIDS crisis on a more global scale. This one in Mexico City, reading Todos juntos podemos parar el SIDA, which basically translates to Together we can stop AIDS, with people linking arms below it. He also advocated for safe sex within the LGBTQ community because he knew that AIDS transmitted through bodily fluids. And this is another one of his works with the pink triangle and ACT UP. And it is again the motto of silence equals death and being united in their anger. And his final piece is Purpose to Left, unfinished, and it is to show that his life's work was cut short, and his life was unfinished. His legacy was not completed, much like many other gay icons at the time who died of AIDS. Their legacy will never be fully completed. Another artist that created art during the AIDS crisis was Felix Gonzalez Torres in New York, and pictured here is one of his most well-known pieces of art, and it is 175 pounds of candy, little wrapped candies, and is the same ideal weight as his partner Ross, who had AIDS. And as people took pieces, the pile slowly deteriorated, just as his partner Ross's health deteriorated through having AIDS. And the pile was replenished each day to give Ross a sense of eternal life, though both Ross and Felix died of AIDS. And many art pieces of Gonzalez Torres were dedicated to Ross, such as these next few. This one being titled Perfect Lovers. And they were 2 store clocks that you can really just find anywhere, like school clocks. And he put the batteries in at the same time and started them at the same time. And they would run at the same time until eventually one would fall out of sync or the other's batteries would die. And one would stop and the other would have to keep going and going, until eventually the second clock stopped at the exact same time as the first clock. And that gave this piece the title, Perfect Lovers. Another image is the imprints of the 2 bodies in a bed. And this piece was displayed throughout Manhattan on billboards during the AIDS crisis to really signify the loss that is occurring within the LGBTQ community of people who once were there, their imprints fresh, and are there no longer. And Princess Diana was actually influential in kind of understanding the AIDS crisis and helping AIDS patients. Because before Diana's interjection, there was extreme misinformation on AIDS transmissibility, which led to extreme mistreatment of patients. Seen here shaking hands with an AIDS patient, which was something that was revolutionary at the time because many people thought AIDS spread just through touch or in being in the same room and breathing the same air as them. But that was not the case, and she went as a big public figure and dispelled the stigma of how AIDS spread, and she was the first major public figure to do so. And it was a monumental push in the effort to treat AIDS patients with respect, and she really put a public eye on the crisis and how it functioned. And one of the biggest pieces to come out of the AIDS crisis was the AIDS memorial quilt. Many people alive during this time remember this piece as significant and rememberable. And only part of the quilt is pictured here in the National Mall. If you've ever been to the National Mall, you know how big this really is. It's massive. And when someone dies of AIDS, they can add a patch to the quilt. And as of 2020, the quilt weighs 54 tons. Every patch represents a life stolen by AIDS. Every little color down there, every pixel and speck represent another life that was lost to AIDS. And it is the biggest piece of community folk art in the world. 36.3 million people have died of AIDS since its first appearance. And this population is equivalent to just over half the population of the United Kingdom dead. And the AIDS crisis has lasting effects even into today. Men who have had sex with other men, MSM, were previously banned for life from donating blood up until 2015 due to AIDS transmission. But as of 2020, they updated the rule that if a man has had sex with a man only in 3 months before donating blood, they are still ineligible. And this is based on the assumption that gay men engage in riskier sexual behavior than straight men, and that gay and bisexual men have higher incidence of AIDS, so they are eliminated from the donor pool before even having their blood drawn through questions given by the Red Cross. And the effect of AIDS on the queer community is something that is extremely difficult to summarize, but in my best words, it really signified countless lives being cut short, and that in turn caused a lack of queer elders or mentors to look up to in the community. Many people now who would be older in the gay community that younger people could look up to and see as old gay men in love and that it can happen are dead due to AIDS. And this was also due to its status as a health crisis. It caused societal stigma toward gay men, especially in healthcare and the LGBTQ community as a whole. And it wiped out a significant portion, a majority of a generation of queer people, and really exposed how the public deems LGBTQ lives as not worth saving or not worth researching to put the funds to save. And another big jump here in history is gay marriage being legalized in 2015. And this is after many states had put civil unions in place, and it was legalized through the Supreme Court case Hodges v. Obergefell. And it was cause for celebration in roughly half of the nation. In 2015, roughly 60% of Americans supported gay marriage. As seen here in this chart, that is significantly better than in the late 90s when it was only 27%. And though there is still a long way to go, we have made it up to 70% in 2021. So we have made big strides and leaps, but there's still at least another over 25% of the country to go. And civil unions, which I briefly mentioned before, is basically a legally recognized union primarily used for same-sex couples, and it's used in place of marriage. It basically means marriage without the legal rights of being married. And Vermont was the first to recognize civil unions, which is something pretty cool in our own local history. And civil unions were critical in helping gay marriage become legalized because they were that first step in showing that it's okay and that it can happen. And there was a strong pushback from the Conservative Party in Congress. As you can see over here, a lot of these states that have a ban on gay marriage do swing to the right. And the ones who had allowed gay marriage or soon would are tending to lean more left. And in 2015, public opinion switched majorly from majority opposition of gay marriage to majority support. And then in the next year, 2015, it was legalized and the entire country would turn green. And it was legalized through Obergefell v. Hodges, which is a challenge on the constitutionality of Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee's bans on same-sex marriage. And this was taken to the Supreme Court, arguing that the ban violated the equal protection and due process clauses. The Supreme Court decided in a 5-4 decision, so a close decision, for the fundamental right of same-sex marriage. And it is absolutely possible that this decision would have been different in the current, more Republican-leaning courts. And just a warning on this next slide and the next few slides, there is a discussion of violence, specifically shooting, the Pulse nightclub shooting. And the Pulse nightclub shooting occurred on June 12, 2016 at 2:02 a.m. when a man entered a popular Orlando gay club and killed 49 people, injuring 53 others. It is the largest hate crime perpetrated against the LGBTQ community and the second deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history. The shooter was in the building for 3 hours and 13 minutes with hostages. The gunman said that he committed the killing because he, quote, got upset by two men kissing in a public space, and decided that the best way to deal with that was to go into a popular gay club and kill roughly 50 men. The killer, Omar Mateen, spoke with authorities over 4 separate phone calls during his 3-hour hostage situation for a total of 29 minutes, about a sixth of the time he was in there. And this police inaction drew a lot of public backlash, both in the media and from the LGBTQ community. And just this November in 2021, the Pulse shooting memorial was vandalized and burned down, showing that the hate really is not gone. It's not as extreme, but it is still there. And this also had an immense effect on the LGBTQ community. Everyone kind of went into a state of mourning, and it really instilled fear into the community. It turned previously safe spaces into a dangerous location where you could be shot and killed. And memorials were set up across the nation honoring those who lost their lives. And many gay people that I have talked to, along with myself, remember feeling that could have been me. That could have been any gay club in America. That could have been any gay man in that bar getting shot and killed out of hate. Now, fast forwarding to today, Pete Buttigieg is the first openly gay cabinet secretary in U.S. history, which is another really big stride in LGBTQ political standings. And at the same time, transgender hate crimes are at an all-time high, specifically affecting the Black, Indigenous, people of color community, or BIPOC community. Also during this year, 2021, workplace discrimination was banned through the use of the Civil Rights Act, and it disallowed sexuality-based discrimination in the workplace. Finally. And throughout this year and throughout kind of this decade, LGBTQ celebrities have become increasingly more visible, giving more mentors to gay youth and LGBTQ youth to look up to. So if there's anything to take away from this presentation, it is that queer people have been in history the entire time. We are woven into the fabric of the past while simultaneously creating a vision of the future. Though we have been hated by society and systematically targeted by the government, we have overcome. We have fought for our lives and right to live for decades, yet still, we have been killed by the millions and hundreds of millions and still persisted. We have come so far, and yet we still have so far to go. Our stories might not be told, but they're there for anyone who cares enough to look. I'm going to end this presentation with some resources for LGBTQ youth. The Trevor Project is a crisis intervention and suicide prevention service to LGBTQ young people. And another more local organization is Rural Outright. It supports advocacy for rural LGBTQIA+ Vermonters. And Centerlink is a website that allows LGBTQ youth to find and connect with local LGBTQ+ community centers. And there are many more resources that are amazing on this LGBTQ resource list by GLAAD. And my sources are here, and I will be widely distributing this presentation. So if you ever would like to visit any of these sources, they are organized by each category, and many of them have more resources within that website to really deep dive into the research. Thank you so much for listening, watching, or attending this presentation, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.